Because euphoria has been deemed to be a crime, the whole world is suffering. I am the Reverend Dean Becker. I'm a reporter for the Pacifica Radio Network. I'm a former cop. I'm a speaker for Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and I'm also a contributing expert at the James A. Baker III Institute at Rice University. Now today, with the help of 19 expert friends from around the world, we are going to claim the moral high ground in the drug war. Now, more than 100 years ago, charlatans pretending to be moralists and Christians fooled the United States, and later, through the United Nations, fooled the whole world into believing that those who use drugs are immoral, sinful, deserving of punishment and eternal condemnation. I traveled the world. I attended more than 100 conferences. I've done more than 10,000 interviews. But it was about 20 years ago I heard of a march in Austin, Texas, in protest of a rogue cop, Tom Coleman, who had busted 40 black individuals for cocaine. It was led by a Mr. Kevin Zeese, who headed up this journey for justice.
We went from town to town in Texas, from prison town to prison town, towns that were based on prison populations for their income. And we had this jail cell behind the trailer. We also had medical marijuana users in the trailer, in the van. People using marijuana medically in 2000 in Texas. Pretty amazing. So we had many conflicts with the police during that tour. And I'd get out and talk to the police, of course, keeping them out of our RV because we didn't really want them coming into the marijuana smoke. And no one was arrested. And in fact, we've discovered along the route, there was one moment where I was taking a break and our crew went out to tour a town and they got pulled over and I got a call that someone was in a police car. So I went out to the event, talked to the police, said, look, we're just doing First Amendment stuff. This is our right to protest, our right to organize, to raise these issues. And then over the microphone of the cop was someone says, is that those people with marijuana leaves on their car? If it is, leave them alone, let them go. And we realized in the midst of the presidential race that George W. Bush did not want a focus on mass incarceration in Texas. And so we knew then that we were free. And then we went on to the Capitol, the Tulia issue, a fantastic march on that Tulia, horrible rogue cop racist enforcement. We protested at Al Gore's campaign office as well as George Bush's, because both parties were terrible on this. But it was a great event, I think a really important event. I'm so glad that you brought it up. That was one of the major goals of Drug Policy Foundation when Arnold and I started it and started to plan about what we wanted to accomplish. One of the main goals was to make opposition to the drug war respectable. It was a third rail issue. In other words, any politician who touched it would die. And we tried to turn that around and into a respectable issue. Arnold brought to it, he was about 55, 60 years old, elder statesman, elder academic, had a history of working on civil rights issues. And he brought with it a lot of, age and experience. I brought with it a public interest lawyer. And so we combined to form Drug Policy Foundation, which became the largest drug policy reform group in the history of the country. It merged with the Linda Smith Center, and now it's Drug Policy Alliance. So whenever I think of Arnold and me and our work, I don't think of just Arnold and me. I think of the whole movement. Because what we were building, and you're part of this too, your role was very important. I don't know if you know how important the work you were doing in independent media was, but all of this was important. That's what movements are, made up of lots of people coming together. On Popular Resistance, we have a movement school. If you go to popularresistance.org, it says school on top. It's a web-based school, 8 classes on how social transformation occurs. We discuss how movements develop, the 8 stages of social movements, how they grow, how they become effective, how the status quo fights against us, how you overcome it. There's amazing history there. And the drug war, ending the drug war, is part of that kind of process. We are in the stage of winning. Now we have to protect those victories and build on them. This is the final stage of the drug war. This will be the last decade of the drug war. And I think the work that Arnold and I built on, because we didn't start it, normal existed since 1970. There was a group called LEMAR from the 1960s, legalized marijuana. So it's a long-term process. We came in at a good time that we could kind of make it respectable, but it's continuing and it's ongoing. And we are going to win this issue in this decade. The drug wars days are numbered, and it's thanks to the work of you and really hundreds of thousands of other people that made it happen. Arnold and I were lucky to form the Drug Policy Foundation at the right time and do what we could to help build that broad, diverse movement that was needed to make this happen.
I just found out last night that Arnold Trebeck had passed away, I think yesterday. Now, he was 92. He led a good long life. But, you know, he's an historical figure. He, together with Kevin Zeese, founded the Drug Policy Foundation in 1987-88. And they really saw themselves as creating what Arnold called the loyal opposition to the war on drugs, and bringing together people from the U.S. and internationally, from all walks of life, who really were committed to the notion that we needed to end the war on drugs and move in the direction of harm reduction and ultimately the responsible legal regulation of drugs. And it's where many of the sort of pioneers of drug policy reform, myself included, met many of our allies. It's where academics got to know people running needle exchange programs, got to know people working on criminal justice reform, got to know people working on psychedelics issues and on harm reduction issues and all of that. Well, I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, the drug war has been, been a nightmare all around the world. And the sad thing, of course, Dean, is that in some places the drug war is picking up steam. Yes. Not so much in the U.S., but when you look in parts of Asia, parts of Africa, I mean, there's Latin America, there's a rolling backwards on some of this stuff, which deeply concerns me. Yeah, other governments in Asia now pointing to the Philippines as a bit of a role model and taking inspiration from the Philippines, not unlike the ways some Asian governments followed in Singapore's footsteps years ago with their very draconian policies. So, there are exceptions and there is movement towards harm reduction in a few areas, but it's very tough going. Meanwhile in the U.S., though, I think we're generally moving forward in most places. Although obviously having an attorney general like William Barr has been a real problem.
From 1979 until 1989, I was assistant counsel to the House Judiciary Committee, first for the Criminal Justice Subcommittee and then for the Crime Subcommittee. And those subcommittees have been merged. So now it is the Subcommittee on Crime and Terrorism and Oversight. I helped write the legislation creating the President's Commission on Organized Crime. But most importantly, I worked on drug legislation throughout that period, conducting numerous oversight hearings of the Drug Enforcement Administration, writing legislation to increase penalties, increase DEA's powers, amending the Controlled Substances Act in a variety of ways, and helping to create the Drug Czar's office. So during the years that Ronald Reagan was the president and the modern war on drugs was ramping up, I played a really central role in the Congress in how that all developed. The dynamic was that drugs became very quickly a partisan political issue. And I was as much involved in that as anybody. When President Reagan came in 1981, he wanted to cut the federal budget. And the Office of Management and Budget proposed cutting about $300,000 out of DEA's budget. This is an infinitesimally small amount of money. At that time, their budget was less than $180 million. And, it's more than $2 billion now, just to give you a sense of its growth. So as soon as the president announced that he was going to ask to reduce the sum of DEA's programs, we as Democrats leapt to the attack, and I helped write the talking points for those attacks on the president and his cutting of our anti-drug effort. in legislation, when the question was how much money should be appropriated for some anti-drug program, there was partisan competition for being tougher. And that's the kind of thing that you're talking about. There was prison construction money in particular in 1986 that I recall, where we started out with some small sum, an amendment would be offered and it would be amended then by the other side to be larger, and then the other side, the first side, would seek to increase that amount. And so it had, without sort of any sort of sense of how many prison beds might this be paying for, how many might we need, what might be meaningful in affecting federal prosecution policy, or what might be meaningful in affecting the market for the drugs they're trying to control. None of that was really driving this. It was all very much about partisan perceptions. It was also driven by the individual ambitions of individual members who wanted to establish their reputation as tough on drugs and tough on crime.
You know, we tried to blame other countries for our drug problem, which is how the U.S. government, justifies spending all this money on international efforts to either eradicate or interdict drug supplies. And it hasn't worked. We've been doing it all of my lifetime, pretty much. And after more than $1.5 trillion or so, the drugs are winning. So if you look at the government's own indicators of success or failure, the price, purity, and availability of drugs, those are at record levels of failure or near record levels of failure. The U.S. government has played both sides of this issue. So on the one hand, we say that we're opposed to these violent groups and things, but on the other hand, we back a lot of these governments that also support these things. Honduras is a good example, for instance. Colombia, we've backed a number of regimes that have been implicated in the drug trade, etc. It's the dealers we like, or the dealers we can tolerate officially versus the dealers that we want to make traffickers we want to make public enemies of. So it's a political tool in many ways. There's no consistency. Duterte is doing something very similar in the Philippines. He's taking all of these, nuisance issues, petty crime issues, structural poverty, neglect, and thrusting it all, scapegoating it all onto one group, drug users. And he's telling people, just kill these people. Just get rid of them. They're poison, they're trash, no mercy, and that's how we'll solve the problem. Duterte actually bragged that he said, Hitler killed 3 million Jews, killed 6 million actually, but he said 3 million Jews. I will be happy to kill 3 million drug addicts. He campaigned on this issue. He promised he would do it, and he's doing it. And by many accounts, he's killed up to 30,000 people thus far. And he's only been in office, 6 months longer than Trump. So in many ways, he's the proto-Trump. He is the Mussolini to Trump's Hitler, if you will. He came before and he pioneered a lot of these repressive authoritarian tactics and scapegoating. Scapegoating is really important because it's a term that comes from the biblical era, right, where the priest or the rabbi would whisper the sins of the village, confess them into the ears of a literal goat, and they would drive the goat off into the desert. And that's how you would cleanse your village of ritual sins. This is what Duterte is trying to do with the drug war. Just put all the problems into one basket and say, just kill these people.
To me, as an outside observer, it does sometimes look a little bit like a holy war that your politicians are leading against drug addicts.
Yeah,
against drug addicts, and that's a bit sad to see. In many ways, we did once have an Iranian delegation coming to Switzerland, and in some aspects they were quite open to what we did and quite interested also because they also have an opium problem there, and they were quite open. So I still do hope that your holy warriors will sort of slow down a little bit and be open to arguments, to ethics also. It has to do with ethics. What do we do with our young people, or not so young people, doesn't matter. It started in the late 80s with the safe injection room. We had the first safe injection room in Bern, Switzerland, where we didn't talk about heroin prescription yet, but we just or my predecessors in that area, they just thought we need to prevent those horrible overdose deaths by providing a safe environment. As you're aware, what could be worse than 70,000 people dying every year? Huh? That's the thing. Actually, I can only tell you how we did it, and we did. I think the most important thing was that there was a public awareness of the problem. I'm not informed if there is that public awareness, but the drama and the horrible things that are behind those open drug scenes were very well visible in Switzerland, since my town, city of Bern, 200,000 inhabitants, is a small town. It was visible for everyone. There was crime related to those open drug scenes. There were up to 1,000 people like there around the federal building. That was visible for press people, for politicians, as well as for the general public. And as a consequence, it was mainly the city governments of several big cities who said we need to try something different. One thing I think is very important also to note to your earlier remarks about fentanyl, cutting heroin with whatever. It's the unpredictability for a drug addicted person to predict what's the effect of what I'm taking.
Right.
And that is very, very, very dangerous. We did those analysis just with heroin in the street injection room. We asked people to give us a little amount of what they are injecting, and we did find concentrations between 3-4% of heroin up to 70 or higher percent of heroin. And that is so dangerous. That is so dangerous, this change of concentration. So you get used to sort of, I mean, it's always a visual decision to take that much, and then suddenly this is like 7, 8, 10, 15 times as strong as the last batch. That is very dangerous. So with heroin prescription, of course, you have that problem you don't have.
I was privileged enough to be working at the federal, provincial, territorial, which is the senior levels of government in Canada, and chairing a number of committees which looked at the problems, the public health problems associated with injection drug use. And we looked to Europe for some of our answers. Well, we had opened up needle exchanges in Canada in the early 90s. But looking at some of the issues with HIV, with hepatitis C, with crime, with overdoses, etc., we were really struck with what Switzerland was doing along the spectrum of opioid-assisted therapy, maintenance therapy, for people who weren't ready to get off but needed to stabilize their lives. And there was obviously a fairly high failure rate with the current gold standard, which was methadone maintenance. And they had moved to using heroin assisted treatment for people who could not be maintained satisfactorily or who weren't good, for whom methadone did not work. And that was such a key thing that they also had across Europe these supervised consumption sites where people could bring their drugs and inject them under the oversight of a nurse or a physician and get primary health care and counseling as well. And so one of the first steps we thought we might do, we had proposals for heroin-assisted treatment in Vancouver, but we wanted to open up see how we could open up supervised consumption sites as a public health measure to deal with the epidemics of hepatitis C and HIV. And I just happened to steer the policy papers that looked at whether this was feasible, how you might do it, and led the process that led to the point where the Minister of Health of the day was convinced that he would conduct a clinical trial, give us an exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which the Minister of Health can do in Canada, and run a well-evaluated clinical trial to see how that would happen, and create the ways in which local municipalities, local health authorities, local police forces, and communities could cooperate to establish the criteria under which such a program could be opened up. Then if it didn't work in Canada, we'd have the evidence to say it didn't work and why it didn't work. But if it did work, you'd lay the groundwork for expanding an evidence-based intervention. And so that was the insight and the evaluation of insight. And it was that scientific evaluation that led 13 years later to the Supreme Court of Canada decision that the federal government, which had changed to become a very conservative government, was trying to close insight down. And that led the Supreme Court of Canada to say that it was actually a human rights issue, that this was a well-proven, valid, effective health intervention measure, and Health Canada and the federal government could not shut it down.
Now that has gone on to expand well beyond Vancouver, has it not?
Yeah, in the face of the opioid epidemic crisis, we have probably 30 or 40 supervised consumption sites across Canada now, in every place where they have overdose issues, every town, urban connotation, etc. We also have overdose prevention sites, which are places where you can inject, but you have somebody who's there with naloxone who could reverse the overdose were it to happen. Yes. So we have about 25, 30 overdose prevention sites in British Columbia, and again, a number of them across the country.
Yeah, certainly there are drug-related harms. You can become addicted and you can overdose in the context of addiction, even if you have absolutely pure known drugs, as we've seen with the opioids. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, making possession illegal doesn't protect you from those harms. And making people move from prescription opioids, where at least you have the chance to know the dose and the purity, to street drugs, where now it's all contaminated with fentanyls pretty much, and you have no way of knowing if this is going to be a shot that like gets you high or kills you or does some bizarre thing that you were completely not expecting. Sure. So I feel like, and I'm currently writing a history of harm reduction, and I feel like this is how our policy should be made. The idea should be to reduce harm. The idea should not to be, we must not have people getting high, that is immoral. Because if that were our goal, we would have to illegalize cigarettes and caffeine and alcohol as well. And we already know that would be a disaster. The reason that the drugs that are illegal has to do with racism and historical contingency, not to do with what's more dangerous. So if we want to save our kids, make sure that they have a chance of surviving their adolescence when they are going to do dumb things, no matter what parents want, we need to make sure that we reduce the harm that they are exposed to. And we don't do this by the current drug policy. It doesn't work. What it does is it exposes them to more harm. So the way we look at this, we have to take a look at, what are the actual dangers associated with the pharmacology of certain drugs? What are the dangers associated with taking them in certain settings, i.e. driving, which is bad, and, work at it from there. Like, look at it as a practical problem, not a problem of, I disagree with people having unearned pleasure. So I think, what's important to realize is that human beings are going to do lots of stuff that other human beings disapprove of. The only place in which the government should be involved is if that is harming someone. If it's not harming someone, just leave it alone and work. We have plenty of problems that are causing real harms to lots of people, and we have plenty of money that should be going to those things that we are wasting on the drug war.
Mr. Anslinger got into it back in the 1930s as who we consider our nation's first drug czar.
Right.
He really made it an issue of race for, I guess you could say, multiple cultures. Yes, we had our opium policies before that with the Chinese, but that was about the Chinese and doing what we could as a country here to, prevent the Chinese from taking jobs and becoming I guess, an economic force, if you might say, in the U.S. economy. So it was about the Chinese, but when Harry Anslinger got into it, he made it about of course, it was already about the Chinese, but he made it about the Mexicans, he made it about blacks, people of color, and we've been rolling ever since with this, with these drug prohibition policies and the so-called war on drugs, war on people. As a society in general, we've developed our perceptions of people and our stereotypes of people. And, in the policing culture, now I'll be honest with you, Dean, yeah, we have a big racial problem within policing, but it even goes beyond that into this place of class, right? So it doesn't matter what color you are.
Yep.
If you're not at a certain class level, you've got problems with the police. If you're poor white, you have a problem with the police, generally speaking. If you're homeless, you have a problem with the police. And the police have gotten to this place of dehumanizing people, right? Especially when it comes to class and when it comes to color. And they've gotten to this place where they see people on a lower economic scale and people of color, they see them as objects. They don't refer to them as people, they refer to them as subjects. They refer to them, and some of the names I won't even mention on your show, derogatory names that we give people. And that kind of gives them it kind of protects them emotionally from when they decide to do harm to people. When they don't see him as a person, when they don't see him as human, and they see him as an object, then it kind of frees their mind to treat that individual as they see fit. And as you said, Dean, to teach them a lesson, right? The policing culture that's depicted in The Wire is so true and it's so real. And it's now played out in real life in Baltimore City with the arrest of so many police officers who were a member of this gun trace task force, who were robbing people on the street corners, robbing drug dealers, planting guns, planting drugs, committing home invasions. These are the police, wearing a badge and carrying a gun.
In the United States, when we think about what are the public policy implications, we have to think about the numbers of people that we have in jail, for example, and the numbers that we now have over 2 million people in jail and about 7.2 million who are under criminal justice, supervision, parole, probation, and those sorts of things. When we think about the thing that has really driven that, it's clear that our sort of assumptions about drugs and how awful drugs are and us needing to do something about drugs has really driven this sort of increase in our prison population. We have the 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison population. And so some of us are embarrassed by that and concerned by that. But when we really start to go inside of the numbers of the sort of hyper-incarceration, we start to see that the hyper-incarceration is not evenly distributed throughout our society. This impact has been even more dramatic on black males. For example, 1 in 8 between the ages of 20 and 29 are now in prison or jail. And then you can see the comparison groups. Hispanics, 1 in 26, which is not good. Whites, 1 in 63. And today, 1 in 3 black males born will spend some time in prison. That's a third. That's a major social justice issue, as some of us have been saying. And then when we think about black males in general in the US population, we make up about 6% of the US population, but 35% of the US incarcerated population. So when you start to see all of these numbers as a thoughtful person in the academy, you can't help be reminded of the words of James Baldwin when he said to be Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. So, we have to do a lot. I have to do a number on myself in terms of tamping that shit down. I really do, because I think about all of the good people in this room, and I think about how it's you all that do that, but can you imagine walking around knowing what's going on? It's a hell of a number that I have to do on myself every day.
In 2018, there were 1.6 million drug arrests. The vast majority of those were for just possession. And so, we're talking about those 1.6 million encounters right there, and then we don't even know how many more encounters have occurred in pursuit of those arrests.
Sure.
And each one of those encounters then has the potential to become hostile or potentially violent. We also know from the data that people of color, Blacks especially, are disproportionately likely to encounter police for drug arrests. They account for roughly 29% of drug arrests, even though they only make up 12% of the population, about 12% of people who use drugs. So, if we scale back the war on drugs, if we stop, if we tell police that we no longer want them to arrest people for drugs, then we're going to reduce so many encounters just by doing that one thing. In this country, there's been a long, long history of moralizing it, right? And saying that people who use drugs are just, bad people or weak individuals, and it's, their personal responsibility, and that whole sort of trope that we've had against drug use. More recently, we've sort of started to see this conversation shift, and it's not a new shift. I mean, you can go back to the 1900s and people were saying that addiction was a medical disease back then as well. But now it's sort of the newer technology we have for these very sophisticated brain imaging scans and that kind of thing. And also with the opioid epidemic, there's this renewed focus on talking about addiction as a brain disease. And there certainly are, components of addiction that have physiological changes on people. But I think, we can't lose sight of the role that a person's environment plays in their decisions to use drugs. And I think that, with COVID-19, I feel like that is going to really bring that into harsh light, because I think that, the way that people are struggling now, whether or not they were using drugs and maybe stopped, or maybe they used drugs, intermittently, and now they have, more free time on their hands because they're unemployed, or maybe they're more stressed because they're unemployed, or lonely because of, the social distancing that we're all trying to, engage in, all of these things that, could lead more people to use drugs more frequently. And so, I think that given that these circumstances that we have now, that we need to be aware of the environmental causes of addiction. And I think that, also feeds directly into the conversation about criminal justice reform as well, because, how do people get to the point where they're addicted and in such a crisis that, the police become involved? Why have every other, tool of, social assistance that we have failed so drastically that's the situation that we're in?
Writing about police corruption in the drug war for nearly 20 years now. There is never a shortage of things for me to write about. It's endemic drug policing. It goes back, as far back as we had federal drug cops, the Federal Narcotics Bureau in the 1940s and 1950s. They had to disband that because it was rotten to the core. I mean, from the very beginning, this has been a problem for law enforcement. It's a ethics problem for law enforcement, and it's a human rights and racial justice problem for the rest of us. This year, it looks like a time when there's really an opening for us because of all the anger towards law enforcement in the country right now, well-deserved anger, I would add. It is really a chance to make some progress. So you people listening, it's time to start bugging your representatives, take to the streets, whatever it takes, let's get it done. Well, you know, Dean, 30 years ago, the Black community was one of the big impetuses behind toughening sentences. Good Black people were scared of drugs. They didn't want their communities destroyed. They supported those drug bills in the 1980s and 1990s. I think they're starting to come around. I think there's really been a sea change.
The whole thing just continued to get more and more obnoxious in a way until we decided we had to do something. And what we felt was the most important was to wake up people the way we had woken up, which was by hearing the stories of what was going on with people and putting them out there for people to see and showing their faces. And so that's where the human rights and the drug war came in. We wanted to make sure that these people's stories were not lost, and you know, as I say, one of the interesting things to me is that when you look at the cover of our book, Shattered Lives, there's 3 people on the cover. There's a white man, a white woman, and a Black woman. By the year 2000, the white man and the white woman had both gotten an early release, but the African-American woman was still in prison for another 15 or was it 15 years? I forget what year Kemba was released, but in any case, you know, almost 20 years longer to get her out of prison. And in a way, her role was the least significant. Her thing was her boyfriend did something. Well, you know, she wasn't even her accused of the crime. She just happened to, because she was living on money that her boyfriend got from breaking the law, that made her a criminal in the system. And so, you know, once you find out what's really going on, it's kind of hard to just kick back. It's like with Black Lives Matter, when you actually see the cops strangling the life out of an African-American man on the street like we did, it's hard to turn away. And we felt that with the whole drug war much earlier.
I can tell you that people who utilize drugs and do not participate in any type of violence pose the lowest threat to our community in terms of public safety. Many people are self-medicating because they have underlying mental health, even physical health issues. You know, I think if you looked in a lot of old ladies' purses, you might find pills that weren't prescribed to them. Yeah. So it's the disparate enforcement that makes people so angry with the system. When we see more Black and brown people, more men, more young people than old people being stopped, searched, arrested, it's not just disturbing, it is a threat to our whole democracy. People must believe our system is fair if they're going to keep participating in it. And I think that's why it's so important that the top law enforcement officials, myself, Chief Art Acevedo, Ed Gonzalez, all agree that social problems and ills are not appropriate for us to try and handle. Those are huge problems that must be dealt with through appropriate resources by our governing bodies and direct service to people. And that declaring war on people who use drugs has not just been a huge waste of money, but it's cut our nose off to spite our face as a society. Yep. You can't send millions of people to prison and refuse to see what has happened in our society as a result. Yeah. A lot of lost opportunity and a lot of bitterness. But I believe there's room in research to absolutely analyze whether legalization with appropriate regulation is in fact a way to lower the crime rate. I really can't answer that question without evidence. Okay. But my gut tells me that when you remove a huge profit making product from the black market, you put it in the regular marketplace, you regulate it, that while it won't eliminate gangs because they're going to find something else illegal to do, you would take a huge chunk out of their profit margin now, and it would disrupt their criminal and violent activities in a way that I think could only be helpful to our society.
For 100 years, this country's been sick. The Harrison Act took effect 100 years ago today, and look at us today. We're right on the verge of some serious changes.
The war on drugs is probably the most corrosive, tragic policy since slavery. The war on drugs was never about drugs. It was about subjugating and controlling vulnerable and unpopular groups in our society. And the war on drugs is starting to wind down because we see cannabis now, the end of cannabis prohibition sweeping the country. But we've still got a long way to go. Well, in British Columbia, just this last week, the police came out and called for the decriminalization of all drugs. So we're making progress. So we are moving pretty quickly. We're sort of competing with some of the other progressive cities in this country to be the first to provide for safe consumption sites. The research, the scientific research shows that it reduces transmission of disease, it reduces addiction, it reduces public disorder, it reduces youth initiation of drugs, it reduces all the bad stuff. So I like to follow the research. So we're moving toward this public health approach to addiction to these substances. But that's just part of it. We're looking at decriminalizing the possession of all substances, small amounts for personal use, and providing major investments in public health as the alternative. So we're really trying to lead the nation in this up here in the northwest corner of America. Again, this war on drugs was never about the drugs. It was about controlling the Chinese with the opium laws. It was about controlling the cocaine-crazed Negro. It was about controlling the Mexicans with marijuana. It was about controlling poor white folks with meth recently. Not necessarily race, it's class as well. So we've really got to look at the war on drugs as a tragic chapter in our past. I am a public official. I'm the chair of the Criminal Justice Committee in the legislature, the point person on criminal justice, and hold the gavel and have some influence on this. So it's a privilege to be in a position as a lawmaker to move policies forward that will see an end to the war on drugs. I think never before have we seen an awakening in this country on the need to provide for racial justice and just more justice, bring justice back to the justice system. Because this is a multicultural, multiracial national uprising. And so this provides us with an opportunity now, a revolutionary opportunity to bring justice back to the justice system. And a key injustice has been the war on drugs. And the war on drugs, as you know, has been a proxy for Jim Crow and for segregation and for discrimination and for treating people of color as second-class citizens. And so the momentum that we now have nationally across races to reform our justice system will, I hope, result in a final winding down of the tragic war on drugs, which has resulted in just the destruction of so many lives, the waste of so many trillions of dollars, and really the degradation of our spirit as a country. So this is a great opportunity right now to take advantage of the awareness. This isn't going away. This isn't just a passing moment where there's a few protests. These demonstrations are part of a national uprising that will not be put down. And I hope that the war on drugs will be sort of a main target to get rid of. The war on drugs was never meant to be won. It was meant to be waged continuously, because on the one hand, we've got the nastiest people on the planet, international organized crime, the cartels, making a whole bunch of money, running the governments of the countries in which they operate. And then on the other side, you've got opportunistic public officials who get to rise to positions of power and are corrupt themselves, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so just the immorality of that we're calling it a war as if we're going to win it. No, it's been a ruse on all of us. It's been a war meant just to be profitable for some and to be a means to gain power for others. Who benefits from the war on drugs today are the criminal organizations that have filled the vacuum that we created by abdicating responsibility. We left control of the drug markets to the criminals. They're the ones who are benefiting. And so if you're asking who benefits, it's the nastiest people on the planet who are benefiting. Those who are taking hostages, those who are assassinating, those who are kidnapping, those who are taking over governments. That's the benefit. There's certainly no benefit for healthcare. There's certainly no benefit for our budget. You know, we say we're being tough on crime. We're being tough on the budget. And so I can't really see a benefit. As a matter of fact, take a look at what we've done by ending cannabis prohibition. Where's the benefit there? We're bringing in revenue. We're reducing youth consumption. We're providing health care. We're reducing traffic deaths because people are drinking less and they're smoking more pot, and so they're not driving. So there's a lot of benefit to ending the war on drugs, to establishing reasonable control over the markets. And so we learned our lesson from cannabis. We should assert control over the markets of the other prohibited substances as well, and we'll see the same benefits.
No more drug war! No more drug war! No more drug war!
Yeah, 18 years a police officer, detective in a suburb of Lansing, Michigan. And there I learned the complete, utter failure of the drug war, in that I knew every drug dealer that my colleagues would arrest or were shot dead by another drug dealer, they were all replaced, you know, immediately. And no matter how much drugs we took off the street in my suburb or Lansing or the Tri-County area, there was always plenty of drugs for anybody who wanted them. So I saw this as a hopeless crusade, if you will, to stop kids and everybody else from getting drugs. What really turned me, Dean, was when I became a detective and started doing follow-up on felonies. People, you know, they rob the banks, they rob the 7-Eleven, they break into your house. And I learned that 70% solid of felony crimes touched prohibition. Over half the bank robberies, half the 7-Elevens getting knocked off were drug addicts who wanted the money. And you could, I mean, and this is what, and then burglaries of homes, 80% were people needing $200 a day for crack. This was not rocket science. This, every day you needed $200 for crack, so you'd go out into my community and break into houses. And this went on and still does today. The number of victims of crime is huge because it is because of the drug prohibition and the skyrocketed prices for drugs. So when I got the chance when I retired to lend my voice and expertise to the anti-prohibition movement, I joined right up. These patients receive twice a day pure heroin, also known as diacetylmorphine, at the clinic, and they go about their lives. And this has proven to be cost effective and also, of course, tremendous reductions in crime, as those addicts don't need to be a prostitute, they don't need to break into cars, rob people, etc., because they're getting their medicine from a clinic under the national policy of universal health care. So this has been an overwhelming success, and that's why 8 other countries have adopted it, because it's Swiss efficient for both saving money and lives. I wish America could grow up and accept science, especially in the field of drug treatment, because we're going to lose another 150 drug addicts today from overdose, and that most of them could be alive tomorrow if we provided them with the proper treatment like the Swiss do. You know, the Swiss buy about 100 kilos of heroin a year, from a lab in the UK, and it's quite cheap when you buy it legally. And so the cost goes down to, a couple dollars a day. And that's, so, bless the journey of people who are professionals who want to save lives by making sure those people have pure diacetylmorphine, AKA heroin, so they don't get the street stuff, which causes them to get a hot shot and a death. This is so simple, Dean. You've been to Switzerland. I've been there, talked to the folks, watched the process. It's just a sad tragedy that almost all these people could be alive tomorrow if we approached it as a medical issue versus criminal. When police officers who, for whatever reasons, want to go after somebody with a baggie of pot or a little bit of crack cocaine or something, they become frustrated when all they can do is basically write that person a parking ticket type offense versus put the handcuffs on them and take them to jail. There's a few bad cops out there, and boy, when they want to go after a citizen, especially black or brown, the drug war is the perfect excuse, the perfect tool, if you will, to go after people they don't like, and they do. So Portugal, 19 years running now, has been an overwhelming success. Good news out of Oregon, you're probably aware, they have it on the ballot to go Portugal. Meaning decrim small amounts of all drugs. So it's handled more like a parking ticket versus anything else. And Oregon might be the lighthouse for America, and hopefully Canada, being more sensible than USA, will say, you know what, we need to do it for all of Canada, like they did with the cannabis, 2 years ago now. Canada went legal regulated tax for God's green plant. So it's all going in the right direction, but as you and I know, it's painfully slow. So what's the morality of a 14-year-old being shot dead today selling the drugs off sidewalks? How do you balance out those two moralities of it's immoral to consume drugs, but now we have a policy which gets a 14-year-old shot and killed every day? And that slows them down. It really does, because it is a competing morality. But again, at the end of the day, I can't get mainstream politicians of either party, by the way, to have a roundhouse discussion on the war on drugs. 50 years, $1 trillion plus, and nobody wants to discuss, is it working? Is it good for? What can we do better? There's no discussion on Capitol Hill. There's no discussion across America.
Yeah.
Like that? Well, whatever.
That's good. Thank you.
The war on drugs largely has been waged against Black Americans and communities of color, and it has produced the largest prison population on the face of the planet, one disproportionately comprised of Black and brown people. And now, at a time that marijuana is legal in one form or another in more than half the states of the union, it is very hard for the formerly incarcerated, and those who have been prosecuted in the war on drugs, to be able to earn a living on the very issue for which they were punished. Meanwhile, as has been the case for time immemorial, the last 400 years in this country, white men primarily have an easier job of finding the investment capital, the legal pathway, and the means to profit off now the legal sale of cannabis in this country. And so I think Kamala understands that in addition to ending the war on drugs, you also have to look at restorative justice for those who've been unfairly prosecuted in that war on drugs. And part of that means access to the opportunities now in a legal marketplace for cannabis. Isn't it just for those who bore the brunt of this to have an opportunity to actually make a living going forward, if that's what they should choose to pursue? So we've talked about the history of the prohibition of cannabis, which really begins in El Paso, Texas, where I'm talking to you from right now, more than 100 years ago. And cannabis was associated with Mexican nationals, Mexican Americans, and Mexican immigrants. And in an effort to keep them down, legally, politically, in economically, the outlaw of cannabis and the ability to prosecute these new immigrants in some cases became part of the policy here in the city of El Paso. It was picked up throughout the Mountain West. It then extended to trying to further control Black Americans in communities like New Orleans, New York City, and marijuana became very much associated with communities of color through the eyes of the law. And so you get to modern policing, which some have compared to the new Jim Crow and its connection to the war on drugs and keeping communities of color down by law. And you begin to understand, how law enforcement has been used as a tool of institutional racism and oppression and suppression of opportunity in Black communities and in communities of color. And so to your point on George Floyd, that white officer kneeling on George Floyd's throat, and he was watching us. He knew he was being filmed by that cell phone camera, and he's looking right into it without any care whatsoever, because he knows he can do this. He's saying to us in his gaze, he says, I can do this because I'm white and this man is Black. There is nothing more for you to know. And I think that is the issue with which we are contending right now. And my gratitude to everyone who has taken to the streets and marched in the tradition of John Lewis and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and so many of our civil rights heroes who understood that in addition to the ballot box and voting and registering and the traditional channels of power, that there's something more that needs to be done on critical issues and at critical moments like these. And it necessitates us taking to the streets. So I think we've got to look at other countries' experiences, as you're urging us to do, whether it's the Netherlands or Portugal or really any other place on the planet, or other states that are pioneering innovative public health responses to drug use and drug abuse and drug overdose deaths. So, Dean, you're really, again, pushing us to think beyond what's comfortable or convenient and to do instead what is right for this country. And I hope that's what we're able to do. There's no benefit to the drug war. I mean, it benefits bloated police budgets. It benefits the police industrial complex, the consultants who teach you how to do a no-knock warrant, break down a door, and dress in tactical military gear to take on, we think about Breonna Taylor, who was killed through one of these no-knock warrants. And to date, Dean, no one's been arrested. No one's been prosecuted. No one's been convicted. No one's even been charged for her death. And she did literally nothing wrong. And is one of the most recent, but only the most recent, examples of the mortal consequences of this war on drugs. So it's not good for human life. It's not good for our democracy. It's not good for our fellow Americans. And so you follow the money and find out who is profiting from this. And I think you find your answers.
Good evening.
It's one of the biggest industries in the world, and it's completely unregulated. It's $500 billion worldwide. In the UK, it's £10 billion a year. But it's not just the huge value in the market which causes the corruption. There's another aspect to this, which again we observe at every level. And you're right to say that it's the same internationally. But the mechanism that causes corruption that I'm about to describe to you works at every single level. It works at sort of regional in a nation. It works at national level and international level. You see, where we do take out the competition and we catch a gang, a cartel, etc., it does mean that another gang has an increase in the market share. Now, I think it's economics 101 that an unregulated market, in any unregulated market, monopolies appear. It's a basic economic truth. Yeah. But with the illicit drugs market, the mechanism of monopolies forming is actually accelerated by the actions of police. So where you create a gap in the market and you get rid of a gang, it's actually usually the most successful gang. It's the gang that's already dominant, which takes advantage of that and expands into that space. This is why there used to be 20 cartels in Mexico. Now there are only 3. But you see, those 3 cartels now have a much bigger share of the market, which means they are individually richer, which means they can use much more of their disposable income to corrupt the system. So the mechanism of policing is actually what leads to increased corruption. Now, what gang with enough money would not corrupt the system to protect themselves? So it is accepted by police leaders, not just in the UK, because I've spoken with police leaders all over the place, including the USA. It is accepted that this corruption is endemic and impossible to defend against. Because what successful organised crime group would not employ people to join the police? Where would they not? And I don't want our criminal justice system corrupted by gangsters. But the only way we can ever stop this is by taking the market off them, taking the power away from them, by regulating the markets. And, you know, it might be a stretch of the imagination for most people in a stable democracy like the UK or the USA or Norway. It might be a stretch of people's imagination to see themselves as going in the same direction as Mexico. Because Mexico is so extreme, or Guinea-Bissau in West Africa is now a narco state, or all of the other democracies that are being eroded by drugs money. But, we're only going in that direction. We are all going in that direction. We're at the thin end of the same wedge. And don't underestimate the extent of the corruption in your police and criminal justice system, because the longer and harder we fight this war, more likely that corruption is going to increase. The issue of racial justice is inseparable from drug policy, because drug policy is what maintains the structural racism within our societies. But you have to bear in mind that the USA has a slightly different view of this. I mean, for drug wars, I researched the way that USA drug policy destroyed the UK drug policy, because this international drug policy, it's a USA invention. It's essentially United States moral imperialism, because in the UK we didn't really have a problem with drugs until we were forced through diplomatic international pressure to follow the USA way of doing things. Cocaine wasn't seen as anything other than a tonic for housewives until black people were seen to be using it, or it was a way of persecuting black people. It was an extension of the Jim Crow laws. That's what the ban on cocaine was. I mean, we call it cannabis in Europe. In America, you call it marijuana because it was a way of encouraging it to be seen as a Mexican problem, a way of persecuting Mexicans during the Great Depression, when Mexicans were seen to be stealing white jobs. It was a way of persecuting. It's always been about racism. The UK is a fascinating example of world drug policy shifts, because it is police voices which are leading the debate. The police are way ahead of politicians. And in fact, where some police leaders have been bringing in heroin-assisted treatment, actually paying for free prescriptions of heroin for problematic users, the Home Office, the government has said, well, we expect our police to uphold the law. But the police are going ahead and doing their own reforms. It's just pragmatic policing. It's following evidence for what is helpful to somebody's health and society. And, there is good evidence that these diversion schemes, from where they happen in other parts of the country, they have actually reduced crime. So you've got to go with the evidence. And I applaud the police, some of my colleagues in the UK, for bravely bringing in these policies in spite of politics and not because of it. And of course, I applaud the Canadian chiefs. But, we've got police voices speaking out on reforms across Europe as part of LEAP Europe, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Is that an evidence-based drug policy is not too much to ask. And where we go for evidence rather than moral posturing, that's where we tend to get movement forwards, because the evidence is so overwhelming that reforms work, whichever incremental reforms we're talking about, whether it's harm reduction, specifically opioid substitution treatment, HAT, heroin prescribing, decriminalization, and most importantly, regulation. There is evidence that these changes in policies work, but there's an unholy alliance between politicians and media and journalism, and what each has been supporting the other in this sort of weaponizing of the issue for a very long time. But I think what politicians need to realize is the public are now seeing through this, despite this weight of propaganda that's come from politicians and journalists alike. That there is a truth here coming through that they need to get behind or be judged very harshly by history, because it's not going to be too much in the near future where we look back on this period of time and think, how could we as a society have allowed that policy to continue? They need to feel the weight of the judgment of history, because now is the turning point. So which of them will get behind these reforms? Which of them will take that moral high ground that the lives of problematic drug users are as valuable as everybody else's? Who will take that moral ground that no citizen gets left behind? What I would love in the United States is for Americans to look beyond their borders, because there is innovation in drug policy going on that the USA uniquely is not really taking any notice of. For example, I am astounded sometimes by how resistant Americans can be to just basic harm reduction principles which save lives around the world. It's bizarre. Trust me, the USA is really weird with this, like really weird. Even things like providing clean injecting equipment, just basic stuff, the kind of stuff that stops the spread of bloodborne viruses and keeps people alive. Why would you not support that?
I can't imagine anything less moral, less ethical than a system, a structure that has perpetuated the relegation of unpopular and vulnerable groups in our society to second-class citizenship. Whether it was the Chinese in the late 1800s, or the Mexicans and what we call Negroes in the early 20th century, and poor whites, or what we might call white trash, in the late 20th century. There's nothing moral about it. It's been profiteering off of suffering. It's been environmental damage in developing countries, destabilization of governments, compromising of medical care, clogging of the courts, violating of civil rights. I just can't imagine anything right about this policy, given the record, the history, the evidence of how devastating it has been in every aspect of our public and private lives.
End mass incarceration! Free our nation! Free our nation! End mass incarceration! Free our nation! All right, thank you.
Do you currently think there is anything that is moral about this drug war?
No, there's not. I think at this point, it's been racially motivated from the beginning, and I think that now we're in a situation where, there's the racial component of it is still there, and then there's also the fact that a lot of people that are in elected office. I mean, for one thing, they're just sort of they are not interested in hearing information that doesn't comport with their worldview or their understanding. And I also think that for a lot of them, it's politically expedient to sort of continue the idea of fear and connecting drug use and crime to those fears. It's an old tactic, and we still see it continuing today. And you see some of it in President Trump's rhetoric about violent cartels from Mexico and drug trafficking. And so, I think for some people that are in elected office, it doesn't really matter if you show them evidence that, needle exchange programs, cut down on the spread of HIV, or if you show them that drug arrests, disproportionately affect Black communities. Those aren't really things that they care about. They care about getting reelected. And so, they still don't want to look soft on crime or soft on drugs. And again, it's politically advantageous for them to kind of have to be able to play on the fear of some of their constituents.
Yeah.
And I think that's just an unfortunate reality of the situation.
I appeal to you. You don't need to find the big solution. Nobody has the big solution to the problem of drug addiction. I mean, it's horrible if somebody you know well is addicted to a drug. There is no cheap solutions, but there is, as a society, ways we can try. We need to try it. Maybe you won't succeed. I don't know what's the tailored solution or way to go for you and your culture, but try it. We did try it. Switzerland is a conservative country, however, quite rich country, and we tried something and it worked. It wasn't the solution for every public health, public order addiction problem in our country, but it was a very important step. And the same could go for you, for your country. Try it in a small project, prove that it's feasible, that it's efficient to do, that it works, and then learn from it and develop it.
So hopefully we're getting to a place where people are starting to realize just what you said, that that's not just unique to Houston. It's not just unique to Baltimore. It's not just unique to Chicago. You can go to any major city, and not just major cities, you can go to rural counties in the South and see the same thing, where they're stealing money from people through asset forfeiture programs. You know, sitting on highways, the sheriff's department sitting on highways, stopping cars with out-of-state tags and taking any cash that they may have by trickery, literally by trickery. You know, so it's not unique to our big cities. It's our small towns, and it's our rural counties as well. And, you know, I hate it when I hear my peers say, well, it's just a few bad apples, Dean. It's just a few bad apples. Don't broad brush the entire policing world because of these few bad apples. I'm going to tell you something. It's not a few bad apples. Yeah. The barrel, the actual apple barrel is rotten. So when these young kids come through these police academies with the mindset that they're going to do good by people, that they want to really help people, after a year or two in that uniform on the street, they're just like the rest of the apples that are in that barrel, because the barrel is rotten. Anytime you have these police departments and these so-called good officers sit by and watch this corruption and watch the crimes being committed by those wearing the uniforms, and sit by idly, as with George Floyd, you know, where the other three officers knew that Mr. Floyd was in distress, with Chauvin's knee on his neck. When you have that, when you fail to intervene or fail to hold your peers accountable for the dirt that they do, you're rotten also.
Let me tell a very important argument from the right wing, from the conservatives. United Nations treaties. The United Nations will punish you, will blame you. In fact, we had that discussion in 2000 at the Parliament. It was approved, it passed, the bill passed, and came into force in the 1st of July of 2001. And what I can tell you nowadays, 20 years after, is that there is a complete consensus, complete political consensus nowadays. Even those parties who voted against the bill at that time are now in favor of our policies, because we have the evidence of the results. Nowadays, you are facing an epidemic on opiates, mostly on fentanyl and similar things, that is also cross-cutting your society.
Yes.
And this crisis, I believe, can be an opportunity. It's almost, well, now we talk about the challenges and the opportunities that the pandemic crisis is posing to all the world. But also this one is a challenge, but also an opportunity to launch the discussion in the society, in the community, and to have a movement of people moving into that direction. I believe in the principle of legalizing, of having the state involved in the production and the distribution and putting rules, but for all substances. Why to have a special framework for cannabis? It is far from being a light drug, as people tend to present it. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
The strains that you can find nowadays in the market are really dangerous in terms of mental health. So if the principle is to avoid contamination, to avoid the black market, to avoid criminality related to drugs, we must think about legalizing all the substances and creating rules. So it's a new paradigm. Instead of the prohibitionist paradigm, we will have the regulatory paradigm. Okay? And I believe it can be a good solution.
Yeah.
What I can reply to this is, in meanwhile, give the step of decriminalizing is a good improvement. Decriminalize drug use and possession for personal use.
Right.
Despite all those discussions, all the discussion that is going worldwide about legalization, about regulation of the market. Meanwhile, decriminalize, and you have clear improvements immediately. There's no reason that the drug war was launched, as you said, with a big influence of the United States and the United Nations.
And based in racial bigotry to start with. But
yes, it's a tool for domination, for racial domination, class domination. And that is what is behind that. So I believe that your society is going through a period where open discussion about those issues can lead to some progress in your model. And I hope that you can contribute for that. I'm sure you can.
I saw you in the backyard.
Oh, I hang out.
You,
my buddy smokes, so I just hang out here.
I mean, it is very difficult to object to the way you have looked into the issues and saying what are the impacts of the way we look into, or the way we try to control drugs, or the way we control to make them disappear from society. I mean, we all agree, of course, that there is a demand, and there is a demand for psychoactive substances all over the world, the legal ones and the illegal ones. I mean, the whole system of saying what is legal and illegal is based on the potential of addictiveness of a substance. Why do we leave alcohol and tobacco outside of that and not have the same levels of control? So it is for sure to say that people look for psychoactive substances and there is a demand. So the supply will always follow because it's also a sustained demand. And the fact of trying to hide that reality and trying to break that reality and trying to live in a parallel world does create many, many issues. First of all, I mean, everyone, even the United Nations, recognizes this since 2008. And as you said it, one of the, what we call the unintended consequences of the regime of control, which are, I mean, they've been recognized since 2008 and they still consider it unintended. So the first of them is the black market itself and the illegal market, and the fact that the policy choice was to leave it in the hand of criminals and not have authorities or regulators taken that market and regulating its access. limiting it depending on the substance, etc., etc. So all the impacts you speak about, what is going on in Latin America, what is going on in terms of funding of different groups, of different criminal groups, those also sometimes engaged in terror, although the evidence there is less clear. It's also more about opportunistic relationships in certain areas of the world, etc. So that is a clear vision of the real impacts, actually, and the big impacts of what is going on in the world. So thank you. And you touch up on something that is so important, which is about the quality of what people buy, or even knowing what they buy, if they are buying the right substance or not. But that is, for us, this is the difficulty with this ideological difficulty against harm reduction, because I mean, drug testing, etc., do exist, and those need to be allowed to be implemented at all levels, at city level, at state level, at the federal level. Now, there is also the issues of, I mean, a city like Amsterdam, or even here in Geneva, for example, where people who inject drugs and are dependent on drugs that go to services like safe injection facilities, that go into, you know, different services, those people, if there is a problem, they can be caught very quickly, and they could report what substance, what they bought it. And so the analysis goes very quickly. And the services of the city, even in Amsterdam, they even put like ads in the street saying something is going on in the black market, do not buy this substance.
Right.
And even here in Switzerland, for example, in Geneva, the communities, because they see what is going on in the safe injection room, when they see people arriving, but this is because people are not afraid to come forward, because the cops are not going to be called, because they're considered patients, because they're given the services of harm reduction services, which allow people then to be sent to the doctors if they have problems, to see also the fact, or to go into treatment. You know, people send them, so they do testing also for infectious diseases, etc., to send them afterwards to the hospital to have a regular treatment regimen. I mean, not for drugs, but if there's any other issue, or if they want to enter into a cycle of treatment, because here we also have the fact of everything is offered. People have to, they could choose a substitution treatment as maintenance for forever. If they cannot get out of it, they could use it for a certain period. They can go to rehabilitation and abstinence. I mean, it really is about a therapeutic contract between the doctor and the patient. It is not about imposing to people what they have to do. It's to help them choose how they get out of their difficult situation. And here again, we're talking only about people with heavy dependence that go to the services, etc. We're not talking about the vast majority, which is recreational, which has no issues and we don't see. I mean, even the implementation of drug laws is so arbitrary. People that can afford to do it behind high walls that no one sees, they do. And they're not impacted to get arrested, etc. They get people to deliver to their homes, etc., whatever they need. So it is also that nature of arbitrary that makes it very difficult. And it goes also, again, to all the populations. But I mean, people are starting to get a grasp of that. And we are getting out of marijuana because, I don't know if this is positive or negative, but I saw the author of The Wire, you know, the TV show, and he was speaking about Colorado and the experiment of the marijuana legalization. He was saying that he was worried because in an interview, and he was saying he was worried to some extent because we are getting out the people that have the political voice. The white college students, we're getting them out of this, of the prohibition if we legalize cannabis because they're marijuana, because that's their substance. And what is going to be the issue with other people that use other drugs and do not have that same voice, that do not have that same social status and class, and that do not have that same presence in the public debate? So drugs are used a lot as a pawn for a lot of things as well. But those are also issues that are related to the socioeconomic, to the ethnic, etc. issues. And that is not only in the United States. That is the case in the United Kingdom. That is the case in France. That is the case in the Russian Federation, where more people that are arrested do not have Slavic names. They have other names. This is the case in everywhere. You know, I mean, you can look at it in every perspective, in countries of the South, countries of the North, the rich countries, etc. When you have something that has been so stigmatized and being built, that's why I said the conventions speak about addiction as evil. The impacts of the prohibition and the war on drugs and being very repressive cannot be concealed. I mean, as we said, there is more violence today than anything. The market is bigger than anything. There is more production. I mean, even when we know that even when there is a disruption, I mean, the records of production of opium, we're having cannabis that cannot be disrupted because it's basically produced out in every country. I mean, 150 countries report production, but I mean, it's everywhere. Now we have new psychoactive substances. I mean, you are going through the fentanyl and the synthetic crisis. I mean, in other countries, there is overdoses related to synthetic cannabinoids because people will be creative and will make things. So, I mean, again, just to walk maybe the half mile there and just to say, it is much more easy and convenient to say, we're going to fight crime and we're going to go after these people, and we aren't going to dry up the demand by being so harsh, etc. I mean, it is very much more difficult to speak about sophisticated, nuanced approaches that are based on science that need to be evaluated little by little, especially when you have such a, difficult political separation and difficult, getting people together. But we have to get people together back again around the table and to some extent really say that this is such a difficult issue. It's not white or black. It's not this or that. It has to be worked a lot, and everyone will have to put in a bit of their own until we get there and we evaluate and we find the best models. We are totally in agreement. I mean, people use drugs for a variety of reasons, around the world and in the United States. I mean, it could be for seeking pleasure. It could be because of self-medication, because of physical pain, because of emotional pain. I mean, it's the diversity of experimentation the diversity of reasons. Everything is changing. There is no more consensus on prohibition around the world. We have a world today where in Colorado, people can buy it legally. And we have, in the same time, people that are being killed extrajudicially in different countries in South and Southeast Asia because of exactly the same thing that is legal in the United States. We have countries with very heavy criminalization and with mandatory death penalty for very low thresholds of possession. And we have, on the other hand, countries that have de facto decriminalization, etc. So we are in a situation that is so problematic and gives actually, because there is no more consensus and there is no more similar approaches, and that always is cracks in the system for criminal organizations to go through those cracks. So the global consensus that we have built around prohibition no longer is tenable because it did not bring any results and brought a lot of harms.
Well, I think we still have a very misogynistic society, and that it's a macho thing to think that we can just find a problem and kill it. Public health is not a war. Public health is science-based. And I think the more that our society can stick to the evidence when we govern and make policies, the better we'll be. And if we look at the evidence and the data that relates to addiction and the spin-off crimes, I think the answer is clear. Low-level users, people who take illegal substances, are not all involved in crime, especially violent crime. They may be the victim because they're operating in a black market. And I worry that people who are part of a vulnerable situation, and you have to see that people who utilize drugs illegally are part of that vulnerable population. They suffer at the hands of criminals, just like they suffer in our criminal justice system.
No recourse to the law they have, though. There's no way for them to report the crime against a drug.
Well, they do, but it lends itself to credibility problems in a court system where the baseline is that drugs are bad, ergo drug users are bad, and not credible. I don't think the evidence supports that at all, but I do think that is a prevalent problem in criminal justice when people who are using drugs are killed by those drugs, or when they're harmed or killed by people trying to rip them off in these black market situations. So I want to stop that, and I think one way is through this MMDP program. We also divert all of our crack and meth cases, as many people as we can, into court-supervised programs where they come out without a conviction. We hope that just gets them out of the black market situation. We think it makes them safer and healthier. And what they do after they're off that probation or court-ordered supervision is often quite different and better than what they were doing when they got arrested.
Would it make your job easier if we decide to once again judge people by their actions, like we used to do before this prohibition, rather than by their possession of a pill or a powder or the cigarettes they smoke? Wouldn't
Of course.
it be easier?
Yes. I've often said that I think where our community and law enforcement became so divided, other than along racial lines, which it certainly was when Nixon declared war on the American people and called it a drug war. I think that communities of color were clearly over-policed. We know that young people were targeted, and we know that this bred an enormous organized crime problem that we haven't suppressed yet. And so I think that the divide, other than the racial divide, which was there, really began back in '72. And that it's important with the living in a time of limited government resources that we take our focus and we put it on the violent actions of people and we judge those actions.
All right, and this one I know the answer to. It's why I do what I do, is to challenge the logic of this drug war. And I want to ask this question of the drug czar himself, of the U.S. Attorney General, of Dan Patrick, of Governor Abbott, any of them. What is the benefit of drug war?
Well, I look forward to their answers.
Kim Ogg, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Dean Becker.
I appreciate it.
Always good to see you. And
oh my!
Thanks for remaining the maverick on the cutting edge that you have always been.
I want to thank these 19 officials for sharing the obvious, ugly, and glaring truth about the drug war, and I want to thank you for watching our program. Transcripts are available at moralhighground.world. Please copy and use the words of these experts to write letters to your elected officials, to write op-eds and letters to the editor. Please do your part to end this madness. And Donald Trump and Joe Biden, politicians anywhere, the door is always open, claiming the moral high ground. I am the Reverend Most High, Dean at drugtruth.net.
Pfizer and Merck kill more of us than the cartel scrap ever could. They thank us for our silence. Each year's $100 billion and the chance to do it forevermore. Drugs, the first eternal war.